Hello and welcome to Whether or Not. This week we have another special Nature in the News episode for you, as well as later in the show we'll be taking a look back to earlier in the season when we had a feature story on a topic that's quite important to an event that just occurred here in State College, but we'll get to that later on. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Whether or Not starts right now. Welcome back and thanks for joining us. I'm Jillian Bohenek.
And I'm Brad Guay.
Well, Brad, things have finally started to die down here in the Department of Meteorology, just in time for classes to start, though.
Yeah, we're getting ready for things to ramp up in just a few days.
That's right. Well, we have a special episode for you today, so we're going to get right to it and head on over to Nature in the News. Tropical storm Iselle made landfall in Hawaii earlier this month on August 8th. It also landed itself in the record books as the strongest tropical system to make landfall on Hawaii's Big Island since reliable records began in 1950. As Iselle came ashore from the east, more than 15 inches of rain fell in the Kulani National Wildlife Reserve. Iselle had reached Category 4 strength with winds of up to 140 miles per hour. Iselle had weakened by the time it had made landfall, and the peak wind gust on land was 91 miles per hour at Mauna Kea, the highest point in elevation in the state. Thousands of residents lost power across the island chain, but thankfully other damage reports were limited. The state capital of Honolulu missed most of the action, and the day after landfall, the scheduled gubernatorial and congressional primaries were able to move ahead as planned. Fear of another storm loomed, but Hurricane Julio ended up passing north of the islands.
Pennsylvania has a long tradition of agriculture, one which touches nearly all of our dinner plates each and every night. Last week, Penn State's Ag Progress Days helped to celebrate that, while also showcasing new achievements. Ag Progress is the Commonwealth's largest outdoor agricultural exposition, and it typically draws over 40,000 people to Happy Valley. This year's show featured 480 exhibitors from 34 states and 4 Canadian provinces. For farmers, Ag Progress is a chance to check out new machinery and equipment that could make their jobs a little bit easier. Meanwhile, families and kids had the chance to see the animals and see how their food is produced. Agriculture is a nearly $7 billion industry in Pennsylvania.
One tropical cyclone in the Pacific had an unusual identity crisis this past month. Hurricane Genevieve became Typhoon Genevieve when it crossed the international date line. Tropical systems with winds of 74 miles per hour or higher in the eastern Pacific are called hurricanes, just like in the Atlantic. In the western Pacific, the same systems are called typhoons. The dividing line is the international date line, and only one other hurricane has experienced this switch in naming conventions since 1950. Hurricane and Typhoon John crossed the international date line during its 31-day lifetime back in August and September of 1994. It's a challenge for storm systems to maintain a western track out the eastern Pacific basin while remaining over warm water, which is why only 2 systems have achieved the name change.
Imagine this, nearly 3 months of rain falling in just 3 hours. And that's exactly what happened last week in Islip, New York, as downpours stalled over Long Island. In all, 13.57 inches of rain fell in Islip, and that set a new 24-hour record for the entire state of New York. Nearly 10 inches of that fell between 5 and 7 a.m. Now with the deluge came flash flooding, which ground the morning commute to a halt around the region. Roadways around the city were soaked, including the Southern State Parkway, which is a major thoroughfare for New York-bound commuters. Sinkholes were also opened in some spots as the ground quickly became waterlogged. Back here in Pennsylvania, our 24-hour rainfall record still stands at 40.9 inches, which was set back in Smethport, which is in the northern part of the state, on an incredible July day in 1942. Jill joins us now with a feature that takes a look at the Weather and Climate Enterprise.
Today, the Weather and Climate Enterprise is an important entity. It includes programs such as the Weather Ready Nation Initiative, which was created to build resiliency in the face of vulnerability to extreme weather events. What is the Weather and Climate Enterprise? I had the opportunity to speak to Dr. David Titley, Director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk at Penn State.
So the Weather Enterprise is the way that we, internal to the weather community, talk about ourselves.
The Weather and Climate Enterprise is composed of 3 sectors, and each has its own unique specialties that are important to the enterprise. The public or government sector is responsible for data collection and the implementation of warnings. It also upgrades equipment such as satellites and radar.
There's the government piece. Most people think of that as the National Weather Service, and that's a very important piece. The National Weather Service kind of has that mission of safety of lives and property. They're the backbone of, if you will, of the weather enterprise. The Weather Service, along with other components of NOAA, provide us the satellite observations that you see every day on your TV screen in the evening. They provide the basic computer models that really help all forecasters, wherever they work, figure out what the weather today and tomorrow and 3 days from now is going to be. So the government's a huge part of the enterprise.
The private sector's responsibility is to communicate weather forecasts and risks associated with them to the public through various media outlets.
The way that the Weather Service disseminates or communicates a lot of their forecasts, including very important warnings and advisories, is actually through the private sector. And the private sector can kind of understand the specific audience and take and tune that data and meet a whole number of specialized needs that the government really isn't set up to do. The government's sort of set up to collect all the data, process the data, give you basic life and property saving information. The private sector can kind of then take it to another level of sophistication and kind of tune that forecast to meet specific needs.
The academic sector is responsible for research for things like improved warnings that will increase lead time, giving people more time to prepare for severe weather.
I mentioned there were 3 sectors, so there's one more, and that's the academic sector. And that's what places like here at Penn State do, with a large number of really smart people who have, almost all of whom who have PhDs in meteorology or atmospheric science or something similar. And what they're doing is they're really on the forefront of the knowledge of what is it that we still need to understand so that ultimately we can in fact have a better understanding of the weather, which will lead to better predictions.
But what makes the enterprise successful? It all comes down to improved communication and collaboration among the 3 sectors and, according to Dr. Titley, trust.
So what we have seen that when we combine these 3 pieces, the academic, the private, and the government, is it's really been a pretty remarkable increase in the capability of what we would call the weather enterprise as a whole. We're seeing about every decade, the forecasts are getting about 24 hours better. So what do I mean by that? I graduated from Penn State in 1980. Here we are in 2014. So really, when I looked at a 3-day forecast back when I was a senior running Campus Weather Service, today's 6-day, almost our 7-day forecast is as accurate as that 3-day forecast that I was able to put out in the late 1970s and 1980. And the way we'll go forward is by trust. The 3 components of that enterprise have to have some degree of trust with each other so that if I tell you, hey, we're going to do something and I'm the academic sector and you're the private sector, I actually do it. There's some credibility and you know I'll deliver on my piece and I know you'll deliver on your piece. And with trust, it doesn't really matter who works for whom or sort of those formal relationships, because trust is like, it's like the oil in your car. It makes everything work smoothly. And conversely, if our enterprise ever runs out of trust, it's going to be tough sledding. So we don't want that. So we want to maintain trust. We want to keep those 3 big pieces working together so that ultimately it's the American public that is the beneficiary of our science and then of the applied forecasts that we can come up with.
During the week of August 11th, the American Meteorological Society will hold its annual summer community meeting right here in University Park with the theme of weather communication and communicating forecasts. The goal is to bring representatives from all sectors of the weather and climate enterprise to develop solutions for the betterment of communication and forecasts. For Weather or Not, I'm Jillian Bohenek.
Thank you, Jill, for that story. And as Jill mentioned in that report, the American Meteorological Society's summer community meeting was underway early last week. From August 11th through the 13th, weatherfolk and some non-weatherfolk joined together here at the Nittany Lion Inn here in State College for a conference that had some very deep topics for discussion. The theme of this year's meeting was improving weather forecasts and communication. Attendees included representatives from all three sectors of the weather and climate enterprise, as well as some from outside of the meteorological community. The purpose of the meeting was to bring together representatives from the three sectors to talk about common issues that we, as meteorologists, have in our community. Topics included the improvement of modeling and the communication of data to the public, as well as issues that social media has provided since so much weather data is readily available for the public to use and distribute. The wide spectrum of speakers and panelists included, but was not limited to, professionals from the communications, medical aviation, and technology fields. Several Penn State students were also involved as both panelists and presenters. The last time Penn State hosted the AMS Summer Community Meeting was back in 2010.
The debate of whether to study space or the world's oceans has been going on for almost 50 years, and discussions are starting to surface. Congress funds projects that include searching for bodies of water on the moon Europa, and yet 95% of oceans are unexplored. The oceans have a significant role in the climate as well as provide food and health to the population. NASA's exploration budget significantly outweighs NOAA's by a ratio of about 150 to 1. Should this be the case, given that government's budgets are shrinking? NASA plays a large role in climate science in regards to their contributions through satellites and other monitoring systems, but the debate on whether it is more of a priority to study space or our own planet has yet to be settled.
A huge stretch of ocean off the coast of Florida has been swamped with red tide. Images from the University of South Florida's Optical Oceanography Lab found a bloom nearly 60 miles wide and 90 miles long, and that was situated about 20 miles off of Florida's Gulf Coast. Red tide is no stranger to the Sunshine State, but this is the largest bloom in nearly a decade, according to experts. Red tide is actually a microscopic algae, officially called Carenia brevis, and while it is naturally occurring, it can kill fish and other marine life. For humans, red tide can cause respiratory irritation if you're onshore and skin and eye irritation if you decide to swim in it. But why would you? Typically, the algae doesn't affect beachgoers until it gets within a mile of the coast.
All right, well, it's time to head back to our Weather Whiz quiz. Earlier in the show, we asked you, what is the greatest 24-hour rain total in U.S. history? Was it A, 40.9 inches, B, 43, C, 48.4, or D, 61.2? And if you answered B, 43 inches, you are correct.
Yeah, that's right, Jill, and that fell back on a rainy July day in 1979 in Alvin, Texas, as Tropical Storm Claudette came ashore.
Now, worldwide, 72 inches fell on Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean, and that was in 1966 during a tropical cyclone. So that's a pretty impressive amount of rainfall. But that's all we have for you this evening. Once again, I'm Jillian Bohenek.
And I'm Brad Gay. You have a great night.